Sarada vs Daemon is about to begin. The battle first foreshadowed in chapter 77 of the original manga. At that point in time, Sarada going up against someone like Damon seemed implausible, but a lot has changed since then. There is a way in which Sarada could bypass Damon's reflection, and it all goes back to the powers of the Mangekyo Sharingan. You see, the powers of Sarada's Mangekyo seem to have different functions, similar to Obito's, whereas it is normally the case that an Uchiha possesses two separate abilities, one per dojutsu. Now Obito was a tad bit different since he possessed one ability but three different variants of it. Now Sarada might be taking this route as well, since based on what took place in chapter 21, her right eye allowed her to use the ability in different ways. The first application of the ability was to form a black rotating sphere, similar to that of a black hole, but it's more so an extreme point of gravity. Now the second application was seen when Ryu tried to attack her with his iron sand, which was then redirected towards the sphere itself and absorbed. This usage of the ability doesn't seem to be passive, since Sarada had to later target Ryu for him to be drawn towards it, which was later confirmed by Mitsuki when he himself pointed out that the gravitational pull was only being exerted upon Ryu, his sand, and Sarada herself. It isn't affecting him, Araya, or any of the natural objects around them, so Sarada is able to choose what the gravity applies to. There's also a huge limitation on the ability, which is that Sarada can only apply the power to what she's able to perceive. This was shown when Ryu tried to attack her initially, but she was able to deflect it towards the sphere since the attack was in her direct line of sight. He then tried to attack her from her blind spot, and she had to look at the attack itself with her Sharingan to deflect it towards the sphere. So let's say one has an ability that she can't perceive, she wouldn't be able to absorb it into the sphere. Now speaking of absorption, the third variant of the ability allows her to implode the sphere itself instead of simply absorbing matter into it. This is how she was able to destroy Ryu's entire body. Those say that this does seem to put a great amount of strain on Sarada since her right eye started to bleed and she then fell unconscious. I doubt this will happen every time she uses the ability. It's likely due to the fact that her body isn't used to this strain as yet, as with any new power-up for any anime character, to be honest. By the way, I did mention that Sarada was able to levitate using the ability as well, which implies that her gravity-based powers works independently of the spheres. In fact, Sarada was able to make Ryu himself levitate before pulling him towards it. And this is implied by the fact that Ryu didn't mention the force of the sphere pulling him when he was initially lifted into the air. It was only after he tried to anchor himself and Sarada used the extra force from the sphere to pull both Ryu and his sand. This means that Sarada has the power to reduce gravity's effect on anyone, including herself, without the pulling effect of the sphere, which is confirmed by Sarada herself floating without being pulled in. This would allow her to get the upper hand on any character who doesn't have the ability to fly, since they wouldn't be able to properly utilize their speed to attack or dodge her attacks. By the way, the inverse is also true as well. Sarada isn't just able to decrease gravity's effect on someone's body, but also increase it. This was shown when Ryu tried to escape the sphere by summoning a clawgram and teleporting using the clawgram's mark on his body. Sarada was able to stop him by increasing the gravitational pull on his body, as Ryu himself noted, to the point that he wasn't able to lift a single finger. This means that similar to Kaguya's gravity dimension, which allowed her to restrict one's movement, Sarada is also able to manipulate gravity in that way as well. At this point, this is what we know about Sarada's Mangekyo, but is it enough to defeat Damon? Well, let's put aside the strength levels of the characters because there's no way to truly gauge it at this point in time. One could argue that Damon is faster than Sarada because he was able to seemingly perform a speed blitz as shown in chapter 26. I will say that it is possible that Sarada didn't intend to physically dodge him and simply chose to activate her Mangekyo instead. The question of course would then be, why? Why would Sarada choose to use her Mangekyo despite knowing about his reflection ability? Well, one could argue that's because she doesn't know about his reflection ability. You see, Damon's reflection is still confusing to most of the fandom, and I think that's deliberate. This Shinjutsu allows him to reflect all attacks if he's touching someone with his palm, and it also allows him to reflect intent, which doesn't require him to touch anyone, whether the intent is murderous or damaging in any way, as stated by Ada. This was shown when Kawaki tried thinking about slapping him to test his abilities. That slap was reflected onto Kawaki without Damon needing to touch anyone. This is similar to how he was able to reflect the guard's intent to cut off his head without needing to touch anyone there as well. And I know some guys are probably saying, well, Damon was secretly touching Ada's hair behind the sofa, but if you look at the panel that came before this, Ada's hair is on the inside of the sofa, while Damon's hand is on the outside. So even if you wanted to argue that touching someone's hair would trigger the ability, that still wouldn't work here. Now some will still argue that Damon just quickly touched Ada's hair off panel and then put it back behind the sofa, but the question would then be, why? If the argument is that when Amado said that he needed to touch someone, he was referring to Damon's ability to reflect intent as well, why would Damon need to hide the fact that he needed to touch Ada, to the point that it was shown off screen? That doesn't make any sense. It is very clear based on what Amado said in the follow-up panel that Damon's ability to reflect intent has different conditions than his ability to reflect attacks. That is what he means when he tells them to be careful not to aim murderous intent because that will be reflected too. This is a completely different sentence. He goes on to say that it depends on certain conditions, but it will be reflected. This entire dialogue wouldn't make sense if he was referring to the same conditions he listed for the ability to reflect attacks, since he wouldn't need to say certain conditions if he already listed what those conditions were. So my point is that while Damon needs to touch someone to reflect any attack that can damage him, whether it's aimed towards him or not, that's not the same requirement for his ability to reflect intent. I believe that this variant of the ability requires him to physically see the person instead. That is why whenever Damon has reflected intent, there's always an emphasis on his eyes. Whether it's his fight versus Code, his interaction with the guards, or when he reflected Kawaki's intent, the focus is always on his eyes and the person he's able to perceive, which kinda does go into my video about Damon's future sight ability. This stems from Ikimoto's interview in which he said that Damon sensed Himawari's future potential, which one could use to tie his abilities together. It simply allows him to calculate future outcomes, thus being able to reflect attacks of something that hasn't happened as yet by simply focusing on the individual. That is why I said it is possible that Sarada simply didn't know this and assumed that she could attack Damon because he wasn't touching anyone. And I mean, it makes sense, since that is what Amado told them, which implies that even Amado doesn't know the conditions for which Damon's ability to reflect intent truly functions. So, given everything I just said, how does Sarada defeat Damon? Well, assuming this is a 1v1, Damon can't touch anyone, so his ability to reflect attacks wouldn't work. Now one would argue that he can simply touch Sarada herself, which he's literally doing at the end of the prior chapter, but that's assuming reflection works on the person he's touching. We have to remember that Damon transfers his reflection ability to the person he touches, which means anything aimed at them would also be reflected. So how would they be damaged by an attack they aimed at Damon? Wouldn't it just cancel since both of them would just be reflecting the attack back and forth? It's kind of a paradox in a sense. I think that is what would happen. Even so, there does seem to be a way to bypass this when it comes to intent. You see, back in Code's fight versus Damon, his intent to attack Damon was reflected onto Code even though Damon was holding on to him. This seemed to have happened since it was Code's intent that was reflected, since Damon was also perceiving him with his eyes, which is why I assume Ikimoto had Code himself say that it was his intent that was reflected. So in essence, what this means is that if Damon is holding on to someone, that still doesn't give him the ability to reflect any attack they launch towards him. But if he's also looking at them, that still gives him the ability to reflect their intent. So keeping this in mind, one can assume that Damon at this point in time can still be attacked by Sarada if he takes his eyes off of her, which could happen depending on what Sumire does. That would then allow Sarada to apply her gravity ability onto him in any way possible. One such action would be to reduce gravity's effect on his body, so he floats up into the air similar to Ryu. This would render Damon useless since he doesn't have the ability to fly as established in part 1, nor does he have Ryu's sand to anchor him. This then pretty much makes his speed irrelevant since he can't run on air. Now she can of course choose to crush him using her sphere instead, but I doubt it will get to that point, and she would have to do it before Damon looks at her again, thus enabling his ability to reflect her intent. That is the best way in which Sarada could defeat Damon in the upcoming chapter based on the info we already know, but there is one other possibility, that of course being Genjutsu. He doesn't inherently cause damage per se, so one could argue that Sarada could put Damon into a Genjutsu, then put him to sleep. In fact, some have said that she already did this when Damon rushed towards her, and all of this is happening in Damon's mind. This of course is very plausible, but is it likely? I don't think so. You have to remember that Genjutsu works by shooting one's chakra into the eyes of the opponent, then using it to disrupt their senses. So there is something physical to some extent that must be forced into the opponent's body, and that could be blocked by reflection as well. And Damon has shown the ability to reflect jutsus that don't inherently cause harm, such as Code's claw marks. And we know this because Code was able to place his marks on Ada for the same reason Shikamaru could affect her with the shadow paralysis. Both jutsus can be used to cause harm, but not inherently. So by all accounts, Genjutsu shouldn't work, but it could work if that is what Ikimoto wants. I guess we'll see. Also, Sarada could just awaken her second Mangekyo ability, and it turns out to be some time rewind ability like Madara's filler Mangekyo ability in the Ninja Storm games, and that allows her to then rewind what happened and then position herself to react to Damon. It could happen, although I doubt it will. I guess we'll see. With that said, that is it for the video. If you guys liked it, drop a like, and also let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Sarada has the power to beat Damon? Do you think that she can bypass his reflection in any way possible? Discuss it below and I'll reply to you guys as per usual. With that said, if you guys want to learn more about why Shiba is future Boruto, watch this video on screen or watch the other one, which should be about something interesting. I'll see you guys soon. Peace.